Mummies have always been an interest of mine. My first memory of mummies is from reading a book on ancient Egypt, which had pictures of the pharaohs like Ramses the Great and Tutankhamun. Ramses here is incorrectly identified as Seti on this postcard from about the 1920s. Strange little error there. Something in those images, the black and wizened visages of once great men, caught me. I do not have words to describe it, but whatever it is has stuck with me and carried me through this project here at Richmond. The Richmond Mummy Project started in my freshman year after I saw an article on the mummy in the Collegian. My childhood interest in mummies had long since become a full-blown fixation, and I had continued to read the most in-depth books and articles I could find on different kinds of mummies and the research being done on them. I dreamed that one day I would be one of those researchers, able to pull amazing information from the dead. Here are two such researchers, Dr. Bob Breyer, who mummified a human cadaver in the 1990s, and Dr. Zahi Hawass, here observing a DNA extraction from King Tutankhamun's mummy 2 years ago, I think. When I saw the article in the Collegian, I was also searching for a research project to accompany my studies in biology. I believed that perhaps my future dream job could have an early start here at the University of Richmond. I contacted Dr. April Hill and Dr. Elizabeth Bond, who both agreed to help me with the project, whatever it was exactly I could manage to do. My original aim was DNA work, to isolate and examine the DNA of Ti Ameny Net. Though ancient DNA study is challenging at best, I believe that 3 years would be enough time to find something, if only I could obtain a DNA sample. The scientific part of the project started in a very strange way. Many authors of my readings had raised concerns about the preservation of ancient DNA and how mummification, particularly in the Egyptian style, might degrade the DNA further. I wanted to test this. Dr. Craig Kinsley, a psychology professor who studies neuroscience, provided me with 2 euthanized rats to test the impact of Egyptian mummification on DNA. I could not replicate 2,000 years of time, but I could simulate the chemical process of mummification, which could help me estimate the quality of DNA I would extract from the mummy herself. I also, as you see here, replicated ancient Egyptian curse tablets, just for fun. After the rats had been mummified for about 4 months, I took samples of their skin, bone, and muscle to determine what type of sample gave me the highest amount of usable DNA. The DNA was affected only slightly by the embalming process, and I was able to isolate several genes successfully from many of the samples. I also used my test mummies to practice different isolation, extraction, and amplification procedures from the papers I had read. While I was preparing to test Ti Ameny Net's DNA, I was reading over her history, mostly compiled by classics professor Stuart Wheeler during his tenure at Richmond. He had done a lot of research on the mummy and discovered that she was from Thebes, shown here, and one of 30 of the Prince of Wales cash from 1869, and that she had been exhibited in the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition before coming to Richmond in 1876. This is her burial site. It's a hill outside of the Valley of the Kings called Sheikh Abd el-Qurna. There were still a lot of unanswered questions about Ti Ameny Net's unlife, however, so I began to delve deeper in preparation for what I thought would just be my senior thesis. Ti Ameny Net was one of 30 mummies exhumed for the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, shown here with his crowd inspecting a mummy in 1869. He took 20 of the mummies and their coffins back to England, where some may still be seen today in the collections of the British Museum, Liverpool, Manchester, and others. Here's Ti Ameny Net alongside 2 other mummies that were almost certainly from this Prince of Wales cache. You can see that actually a lot of the coffins are very similar. But Ti Ameny Net was given to the prince's translator, who took her back to Cairo with him, and about 5 years later sold her to Dr. Jabez Lamar Monroe Curry, who was visiting Egypt on a cook's tour. Dr. Curry was a noted Richmond College trustee and had discussed starting a museum for the new college, then located in downtown Richmond. He purchased the mummy and her coffin in November 1875, and most likely spent all of his money on the mummy and on the customs arrangements necessary to send her back to the United States. These letters are to Dr. Jeter at Richmond College to ask for a donation from Richmond to buy a case to transport the mummy back to the States. Negotiations between Dr. Curry and Thomas Cook, the leader of the world-famous Cook's tours, led to Ti Ameny Net beginning her journey in the States at Cook's World Ticket Office in the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. It is sometime before her display in Philadelphia that Ti Ameny Net's body was unwrapped. I believe that she was the victim of the mummy unwrapping party, a peculiar amusement for 19th century Egyptology enthusiasts who would gather at friends' homes or in public theaters to watch an Egyptian mummy removed from its wrappings and destroyed in the search for precious amulets that were often hidden on the body. Ti Ameny Net exhibits some unusual unwrapping patterns, including the complete exposure of her toes, but not her legs, a hole cut into the wrappings on her chest, and her hands unwrapped to the layers of linen bandaging each finger individually. She also has lost much of the flesh on top of her head. From the ragged edges on this wound, it is not that the flesh was not preserved, but that sometime after its preservation, the skin was torn away from her skull, a probable side effect of resin cementing the linen and her skin together. If Ti Ameny Net had been buried with gold finger or toe stalls, as shown here, or with jewelry or amulets, they are all gone, and the most common location for the placement of these offerings matches the pattern of the missing wrappings. A description of her body on display in Philadelphia describes her blackened skeleton with her head exposed, so her unwrapping took place sometime before her arrival to Cook's World's ticket office. Although only a few documents name her directly, we can confirm that Ti Ameny Net was on display at Cook's. A written account of the fair, which described many of the major exhibits in the entire exposition, described Ti Ameny Net as a princess or priestess of the time of Moses. Her connection to the Prince of Wales was also noted. She was placed on exhibit in about May of 1876, after her arrival back in the States, and sometime at the end of that year, she arrived in Richmond to a great reception in her honor. She was then installed as one of the cornerstones of the Richmond College Museum. After the college's West Hampton move and the transition to becoming the University of Richmond, Ti Ameny Net lost her home at the museum, as the new campus had no museum space. The collection was split among different departments on the new campus or placed into storage, and Ti Ameny Net found several temporary residences in several buildings, including the library and Maryland Hall. Only when Stuart Wheeler formed the Ancient World Gallery in 1979 did she finally have a permanent home. Wheeler took a great interest in the mummy and had her x-rayed, the scans analyzed by famous osteologist Dr. J. Lawrence Angel at the Smithsonian. He also had CT scans completed in the early 1990s. Dr. Wheeler had determined some basic facts about Ti Ameny Net from his research, but the limitations of technology also limited his results. He found that she was female, middle-aged, suffered from mild arthritis, and showed no probable cause of death. We tried to examine Ti Ameny Net not only through science, using CTs and DNA, but also in her social and historical context, which can be helpful in determining the dates of her life, her social status in ancient Egypt, and other facts that science has not yet learned how to discover. The aim was to complete the picture of the person through this research. Mummification in Egypt had a range of techniques, all employed over different time periods or for different classes of individuals. By studying the style of mummification used on Ti Ameny Net, we can approximate her time period and social status. She underwent the most expensive and elaborate form of mummification, resulting in incredible preservation even today. Her organs were removed, her brain taken out through her nose, and her body dehydrated in natron in accordance with Egyptian tradition. The precision of her embalming, plus the large amounts of resin poured inside and onto her body, and the fine quality of the linen used to wrap her body, showed that she must have been wealthy, as mummification was very expensive. Her coffin is also a wealth of information. Here are some construction details from her coffin, showing the chiseled down wood and the little slats that would have fit the two halves of the coffin together. And here the linen that was plastered over that rough wood to make a smooth surface for painting. Literally reading her coffin, we find her parents' names, Ruru or Lulu, her mother, and Nessie Amun, her father. We find the names of many funerary gods and provisions made for Ti Ameny Net by these gods in the afterlife. Coffin styles changed over time, in accordance with available materials, popular iconography, and the prevailing fashion. Here on the left, we see a coffin from the 21st dynasty. You can see here the arms, the style of the wig, and even the colors of the coffin differ greatly from this 26th dynasty coffin. Often, it is possible to date a coffin by these stylistic features. We searched through the collections of many museums, including the British Museum, the Metropolitan, and several German museums, to find coffins that closely resembled Ti Ameny Net's. It is important to match not only the scenes shown on her coffin, but also the overall shape, the style of the face, hair, and necklace, the coloring of the paint, the position of elements along the body of the coffin, and even the language used in the prayers written for her. Finally, we found a multitude of coffins that looked very similar to Ti Ameny Net's, giving us strong proof that Ti Ameny Net died in the 25th or 26th dynasty. So you can see here the coloring is very similar on these two. On the interior here we have the goddess Nut, just as the interior of Ti Ameny Net's coffin has. Even the headdresses look very similar here, that vulture winged look. Much of our knowledge of Egyptian funerary beliefs comes from these coffins and associated artifacts. The Richmond Mummy Project reached its scientific climax when Dr. Ann Fulcher, head of the Department of Radiology at VCU, agreed to X-ray and CT scan the mummy at MCV in the summer of 2010. Here's Ti Ameny Net going into the CT scanner while we wait in an adjoining room. At the same time, we would obtain our DNA sample. Dr. April Hill had supervised all of my preliminary experiments, and between the 20 years of research done by scientists like Dr. Svante Pavo, or more recent famous work done on the royal mummies at the Cairo Museum and televised on the Discovery Channel, we believed we could be successful. Here is the only remains of our extraction procedure. This tiny pinprick here is where we use the bone marrow extraction needle on Ti Ameny Net's femur to try and obtain a sample. We actually had to try 2 locations. Eventually we got a sample from her pelvis that was much more successful, but this was our first and only visible attempt. When we began, April guaranteed, if there's DNA there, we'll find it. And we believe we were successful. In October of last year, I isolated the HLA-DQ-A1 gene, which is present in every human with small modifications. My HLA-DQ-A1 gene, here, was shorter by 12 base pairs than the sample of Ti Ameny Net's DNA that we also tested, which is here, proving that the gene I isolated from her sample did not belong to myself. This is actually really important in science. You wouldn't think so, but it is. Further examination of the gene shows that the particular code present in Ti Ameny Net may have connections to heart disease, diabetes, and certain ancestral groups. We also tested Ti Ameny Net for malaria and for tuberculosis, 2 severe diseases common to the ancient world, and whose presences have been previously confirmed by DNA testing of ancient Egyptian mummies. Our tests closely replicated the procedures used by Zahi Hawass on the royal mummies, but both of our results were negative. Ti Ameny Net almost certainly did not suffer or die from tuberculosis or malaria. My project did not end with the scientific analyses, however. The new exhibition of Ti Ameny Net was proposed in the spring of 2011, and I began work as soon as my senior year started. To me, curating the exhibit seemed a very different type of experience from scientific research. Unlike before, when I had protocols to guide me and a very clear-cut task to complete, curating required a lot more creative thinking, picking and choosing, and getting more into the minds of the public rather than the academic community. Curating typically consists of selecting the objects for a show, completing all of the research on them, and then planning the layout of the show, the text, and other such details. It was fairly simple for me to select the objects we would display, but choosing how to represent my research quickly became more complicated than I expected. We face a lot of ethical considerations in the display of human remains. In the past, mummies have been more curiosities and haunted house attractions, the exact opposite of our objective. Looking back at Ti Ameny Net's past, we find that she too was just this in Philadelphia and likely in Richmond as well for many years. With these modern scientific studies, whose goal was to help reconnect her body with her personhood, we wanted to design a display that would showcase her in a dignified, respectful way. I believe we have done so, presenting much of her history, her science, and her coffin before introducing our star herself. I was helped in all of these decisions by my exceptionally talented team of University Museum staff, my mentor Elizabeth, and my advisor Dr. Bond. But there were still challenges. I found myself struggling to fit all of the roles I needed to fill as the student curator. Particularly challenging was the conflict between my identity as a student and as the curator. In a way, I had to lead the team in making decisions about text, object inclusions, and design, but it seemed quite wrong for me to be asserting my opinions over those of much more experienced adults. Over the course of the year, though, as the exhibit came closer and closer to opening, I found it easier to fit in, not least because my comrades were really comrades, who were all eager to see the show succeed and guide me in the right direction. Some facets of the project I found incredibly easy, particularly when they paralleled tasks I complete in classes. For example, I spent a very enjoyable winter afternoon in the Virginia Baptist Historical Society with Matthew Howell looking over all of the documents they had on the mummy. This research was easy, interesting, and fun. But when it came time to condense all of that information we had into the small labels or the panels, my workload became much more difficult. In the end, we succeeded. We overcame all challenges, and we've put together an amazing exhibition. My favorite story from the last few weeks, when we were actually assembling the exhibit, was when a friend of mine asked on opening day, not to stress you out or anything, but shouldn't your exhibit be, all up already if it opens today? What people rarely see behind the scenes is that we work to the last minute to make everything perfect. Almost all of the elements of the show are debated up until the final hour just to ensure that the result is the best that we can make it. Everything from object lighting to label placement to moving objects is done as close to the opening as possible and probably debated about for hours because we want to do our best in transferring our vision to the visitors. In a paper, this is simple. You write it. In an exhibit, a three-dimensional design, assembling hundreds of components and utilizing a large amount of physical space, additional challenges arise as one considers crowds, the flow of the room, colors, fonts, wording choice, and 1,000 other minutiae that no one in their right minds really ever thinks about. Lucky, then, that curators, I can attest, are not always in our right minds. We care so passionately about our shows, particularly this one, for me, as the culmination of 4 years of work. All I wanted with this exhibit was to present to you, the public, Ti Ameny Net as I see her, as a woman who lived and died and has a story like anyone else. I hope that when you see the show, or if you have already seen it, you have shared my vision, and we can all help Ti Ameny Net enjoy her blissful afterlife by remembering her as an individual. Although I will graduate and move on to new mummy adventures, we have kept all of Ti Ameny Net's DNA samples. I hope that future students curious about the ancient dead will be able to build on the project I have begun. This work is in no way finished. In particular, we hope that the next 5 to 10 years will improve ancient DNA studies so that we can sequence Ti Ameny Net's entire genome. We also hope to study her ancestry through analysis of particular markers and their connection to ethnic groups throughout the world. Studies like these on ancient disease, ancestry, and genetics have a lot of potential to inform the present. Though Ti Ameny Net has not lived for over 2,000 years, she is still among the living, and I believe that she still has much to tell us. My goal for this project, which I hope I have achieved, is that we learn to listen to her and to all of the ancient dead. And if you can please indulge me for a few more moments, this is the closest I will ever get to giving an acceptance speech at the Oscars. Really, though. And there are certainly people I would like to thank. This project was about a woman, Ti Ameny Net, and I find it endlessly fitting that 4 amazing women helped me to complete the project. Dr. Bond, Dr. Hill, Dr. Fulcher, Elizabeth Schlatter, you all are my heroes, my role models, and I am so honored that you all believed in me and have guided me for these last 4 years. This project happened all thanks to you, who were incredibly brave to take a chance on a crazy 18-year-old with big dreams. Next, I want to thank all of the staff of the University Museums, David, Matthew, Denise, Heather, Henley, and Stephen, for listening to all of my silly stories, for those great Sunday afternoons listening to 90s pop, for sharing our adventures in mummy moving, public television, D-Hall visits, and also for doing what you do best. Whether it is working with images, editing, creating awesome children's educational activities, exercising your creativity in the X-ray light box or the coffin's giant case, or discovering new ways to protect and preserve Ti Ameny Net, you have given this project your all, and I am amazed by your work. I want to thank also Richard Waller, our museum's director, for his supervision and guidance through this whole process and his expert input when it came to designing such a successful show. Thank you to my friends and family who still love me despite years of conversations about dead people at dinner, non-stop Facebook status updates on this project, and a healthy amount of mummy-related madness. Lastly, but certainly not least, thank you again to Dr. Fulcher and her staff of expert radiologists at VCU, without whom there would be no project. I now turn the floor over to her so that she can share all of her amazing discoveries.